Hey guys, welcome. This is Module 6, and I wanted to go over the short paper writing assignment for this week because parts of this assignment you will use for your final project. So I think it's important that you have a good understanding of this week's topic as you prepare this short paper. So this week's topic has to do with punishment, and specifically you're going to be looking at mandatory minimums, and then you're also going to be looking at sentencing guidelines. And towards the end of this lecture, I will provide you with how you can apply the concept of sentencing guidelines to our particular scenario that you're working on for your final project, because I think that'll be important. Okay? So I'm going to talk about that, and then at the end I'll briefly touch on our discussion board assignment this week, which has you using LexisNexis, and I will post an announcement as well which tells you how to get into LexisNexis, and then I'll also post a sample discussion board post so you get an idea as to what we're looking for this particular assignment. And this discussion board assignment will also help you with your final project, because there's a couple different areas where we have you look at venue and the impact that venue can have on a criminal case, and then specifically how venue might impact our specific case scenario. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and disappear, and then we'll just have the screen, but you will be able to hear me. All right. Here we go. Okay, so this week, again, we're looking at sentencing guidelines and mandatory minimums. And so the first thing I want to go over and talk about is sentencing guidelines. And specifically, we're going to just talk a little bit about what are sentencing guidelines, some of the history of the federal sentencing guidelines, the importance of U.S. versus Booker, and then an examination of state sentencing guidelines. Now, sentencing guidelines provide a system for handing down uniform or consistent sentences for similar crimes in various jurisdictions. And when you look at the federal system, is so that there is consistency within the federal judiciary when it comes to the handing down of punishment in different parts of the country. Created by the United States Sentencing Commission to be incorporated in each state's criminal code, sentencing guidelines help eliminate confusion among judges in determining the proper punishment for a person convicted of a crime. Sentencing guidelines take into consideration the nature of the crime, and judges may consider the convicted offender's prior criminal history in final sentencing. So it's really a two-pronged thing, okay, in sentencing guidelines. You're looking at the nature of the crime, and I'll show you an example of a sentencing guideline chart. So we're going to look at the nature of the crime. So each crime is classified as going from less serious to most serious. Obviously, the most serious crime is going to get you more punishment. The less serious is going to get you less punishment. And each crime, in theory, is categorized based on that principle, from least serious crime to the more serious crimes. Okay? So as we look at the history of the federal sentencing guidelines, when a person has been convicted of a crime, it is up to the trial judge to hand down a sentence, which may consist of a fine, restitution, and or some level of imprisonment. Now, prior to 1987, judges handed down sentences at their own discretion, which resulted in judges around the country imposing very different sentences for similar crimes. In an attempt to impose consistency in sentencing, Congress passed the Federal Sentencing Guidelines, requiring judges to hand down sentences for each individual case that fall within the specific guidelines. The federal sentencing guidelines accomplished the goal of imposing consistency in sentencing, but many legal professionals felt they were too rigid. In 2005, in the case of United States versus Booker. The guidelines were changed, and the Supreme Court ruled that mandatory sentencing guidelines were unconstitutional. Now judges are allowed some level of flexibility in considering not only the nature and seriousness of the crime, but the defendant's prior criminal history when determining a sentence. So now the judges have some latitude in terms of deviating from the sentencing guidelines. As a result, judges occasionally assign sentences that are either harsher or more lenient than the recommended punishment, though most sentences still fall within the recommended range. So again, the range are now, they're non-binding, but judges still tend to follow the recommendation using the sentencing guidelines. Now, states also have the ability to establish their own sentencing guidelines, and many states did based off what the federal judicial system did. So individual state legislatures establish sentencing commissions to review state sentencing guidelines. Such reviews begin with sentencing standards imposed by the federal sentencing guidelines and include reviewing current laws, policies, and procedures. The Sentencing Commission is tasked with making recommendations to the state legislature and state Supreme Court regarding changes that should be made to the criminal code, criminal procedures, state sentencing guidelines, and other practices specific to that state. While it is important to ensure public safety by providing immediate and clear response to crime, sentencing commissions must also ensure that fair sentences are handed down. The goals of criminal sentencing that must be considered by sentencing commissions include protecting public safety, promoting respect for the law, imparting adequate punishment for crime committed, discouraging future criminal conduct, imposing sanctions consistent with the need to protect the public, and the seriousness of the crime. So here's an example of a sentencing guideline. So it takes in two considerations. Remember, one's criminal history. So obviously, if you've never had contact with the criminal justice system and commit an offense, the court can obviously evaluate your level of criminal history, if appropriate, based on these guidelines. So obviously, here is 1 and here is 6. So it basically tells you your number of prior convictions and how those might impact you. So if you've been, if you had 4 or 5 or 6 convictions for something, that's going to impact your sentencing based on these calculations. And these calculations here are based on months. And then on this axis here are the level of offense. So the more minor the offense is going to be like number 1. So maybe a theft, let's say. A theft with no priors gives you 0 to 6 months. So there's some latitude there for the court. Whereas the further down you go, and typically the federal system, this goes down into the 40s, the higher the range is in terms of months per punishment. All right, so we're looking at the level of offense, in other words, the type of offense committed by the offender, and the criminal history category. And we're looking at their criminal history, and you're going to get points for that. So again, keep in mind that under federal law now, this is not mandatory, but a lot of judges still use this as a guide in assisting them in determining the level of appropriate punishment. So this is an example, again, of what a sentencing table looks like, okay? So you can take a look at that on your own if you wish, or you can also probably Google Federal Sentencing Guidelines table, and you should get something similar to this, all right? So mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines. So what are mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines? Mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines require judges to hand down sentences for a fixed minimum length of imprisonment to people convicted of certain crimes. This means that for certain crimes, criminal sentencing guidelines give the judge no discretion to issue a less severe punishment, no matter what mitigating factors might exist. Mandatory minimum sentences apply to many violent and drug-related crimes as well as habitual offenders. So what we're looking at here when we talk about mandatory minimums is certain crimes that states and the federal government have described as requiring mandatory minimums. So when we talk about, for example, habitual offenders, we're talking things such as 3 strikes, right? When we're talking drug laws, we're talking drugs sold in a certain amount or quantity automatically trigger mandatory minimum sentencing. In other words, regardless of this your first offense or not, the minimum you're going to do hypothetically, let's say, is 5 years. So if you sell drugs that crosses a threshold of a certain amount, then mandatory minimums might kick in. Same thing with using violence in a crime. Use a gun, go to prison is a good example of mandatory minimums. If you use a gun in the commission of a robbery in some states, that is a mandatory minimum. In other words, if you're convicted of committing a robbery with a gun, you're at least going to do a minimum number of years or months, depending on how that state is structured. So that's the importance of mandatory minimums. It takes the discretion away from the court. They really have no say in terms of mandatory minimums. Whereas sentencing guidelines, the judges now have some level of latitude. Okay? So I've already showed you the sentencing guideline chart. And that's, there is some latitude here based on the Supreme Court case that I just mentioned previously, U.S. versus Booker. But when we look at mandatory minimums are for different reasons. It's designed to specifically punish an offender. All right? So again, it could apply to violent crimes, use a gun, go to prison. Drug-related crimes, if you sell drugs over a certain quantity, it automatically triggers mandatory minimums, as well as habitual offenders, 3 strikes, things like that. So there's all kinds of laws regarding mandatory minimums. Each state might be a little different. So feel free, if you're curious, to explore what your state has to say about certain crimes that they deem a mandatory minimum sentencing that might apply. Okay? So next we're going to talk about some legal terms that also pop up when we're talking about these topics. Criminal history is a record of crimes for which a person has been previously accused or convicted. So again, we can take in considering criminal history, which could be aggravating circumstances. Mitigating factors, any factor, circumstance that lessens the severity of a circumstance or which decreases the accused person's fault or responsibility. So we could look at mitigating and aggravating factors that might come into play in terms of better understanding how people should be punished. All right, so you can take a look at those. So how about we apply this scenario to the idea of sentencing guidelines? So our scenario again has a bank robbery which involved 3 characters. So as you consider the punishment that they would get under the sentencing guidelines, okay, we go back here again, sentencing guidelines, we're going to take a look at their criminal history and the level of offense, okay? And specifically, of course, we're talking about Jane, Jed, and Herman. Now, Jane drove the getaway car, and all indications are she doesn't have a criminal history. Jed was armed with a shotgun during the bank robbery and is a convicted felon. So Jed has some problems. Herman was armed with a shotgun during the bank robbery, but doesn't indicate that he had a criminal history. So you would think that Jed would get the most punishment based on the sentencing guidelines because we're looking at his criminal history and the fact that it was a serious crime and he was armed with a gun, could be mandatory minimum. Herman, same way, armed with a shotgun, could trigger mandatory minimum, but he has no prior criminal history. Jane was not in the bank, or at least her actions within the bank might have been minimal. She was not armed, so Jane's culpability might be less than the other 2. So that's how you could apply sentencing guidelines to our scenario as you begin to finalize your paper in terms of how might sentencing guidelines apply and what are sentencing guidelines. And so in your paper, please feel free to go ahead and describe for me how you think that sentencing guidelines might apply to our scenario. That shows me you're going above and beyond what's required. Okay? Critical elements for Module 6 paper are the definitions. So make sure you take a look at the definition. Define mandatory minimum sentences and sentencing guidelines. So you have to define both. Referencing your textbook and resource materials, explain why we have mandatory minimum sentences and sentencing guidelines. What purpose do they serve? So describe the purpose of each of these. The opinion. State your opinion as to whether mandatory minimum sentences help or hinder judicial efficiency, and defend your position by explaining why and how they do so. So here you're only dealing with your opinion on mandatory minimum sentences. Okay? Take a look at the announcement. It'll help you this week in terms of the LexisNexis assignment for the discussion board. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact me, and have a good week.